Well, I think a few people will still drop in, but I propose we get started, because right after this session there is immediately the final keynote session in the same room. So my name is Koen Frenken. I'm professor in innovation studies at Utrecht University, and I will be chairing this session on platforms and the regulatory landscape. And I'm very happy to introduce the four panel members. Bogdan Deleanu, who is on the last chair. He's a member of European Parliament and also head of the cabinet of the chair of the Committee for Employment and Social Affairs. Thanks for being with us. Anja Eleveld, she's associate professor in social law at the Free University of Amsterdam. And Hannekke Bennaars is associate professor at the University of Amsterdam in labor law. And we have Emma O'Dwyer, who is head of labor relations for Europe, Middle East and Africa for Uber. So thanks for joining us. So we have a couple of questions prepared, and we try to finish on time, so to allow for questions from you as the audience. And first we want to get the problem straight. So my first question to all panel members is, what is, according to you, the main problem that has to be regulated in platform work? And I would like to start with Bogdan.
Thank you. So from my point of view, the problem is having for workers the access to adequate and comprehensive information about the work they are going to be doing and the conditions, and the opportunity to make informed choices with that information.
Okay, that's very concise and clear. Thanks. Anja.
Yes, from on my point of view, the main problem is that there is a growing group of precarious workers who is not covered by employment law and also not by social security law. And that we have to see how these groups can also be covered. And then on the other hand, so we did a small qualitative research among food delivery riders, and there we saw that on the one hand, well, that's well known, of course, that riders working as self-employed also prefer to have this flexibility and autonomy, and that riders working as employees like to have the security and social protection, but that also self-employed riders also like to have more social protection, and also that riders working as employees also like to have more flexibility. So I think that's really a problem, how to get this, how to have both autonomy and flexibility on the one side, and security and protection on the other side. And maybe when I can, just one example, because we interviewed also female food delivery riders, working as employees, and they said, well, a problem is that we are not allowed to decline a call. So they're scheduled for 4 hours or 8 hours, and they are also obliged to work in the evenings, some days a week. And this might also imply that they have to go to unsafe areas of the city, and they can't decline those calls. And they said, well, we would, in that regard, we would rather be more flexible. So I also see this dilemma.
Yeah, thanks for explaining this dilemma. Hannekke.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for having me on the panel, Koen, as always. I've identified one problem and one challenge, and I think a challenge is just another word to say a problem to be solved. It's a free interpretation of Janis Joplin. And I think one of the main problems is maybe that the audience or the public or the consumers are getting used to services that are sold below the cost price. I think that is something that we have accepted for over the past years, at least from a legal or academic perspective. But I think that's an important issue with the type of platform work we're discussing now, because it creates a certain demand that, in my view, might be problematic. And the challenge, and that's more a conceptual challenge from an academic perspective, is how you deal with a new way of organizing work. And the reaction so far has been to try to put it into the legal framework that we know, in the regulatory framework that we know, by either adapting the framework or by forcing the platform organizations to work differently. And I think we should rather see it as an invitation to look, and when I limit myself to labor law, because that's what I do, but it might also go for competition law, it might also be an invitation to see how you should or could or might safeguard the principles underpinning labor law, which are mostly common in most countries, compensating for the inequality of bargaining power on the one hand and organizing the labor market on the other hand. If you take away the regulatory framework that we build upon it based on the concept of an employment contract, it might be challenging to see how you can safeguard these principles that are still, I think, valid in most, at least Western countries. It might invite us to think about a new system. So that's the other challenge I wanted to name here, and I fully endorse what both of the others said, obviously, but we wanted to have different things.
Okay, thanks. And Emma.
Thank you, Koen, and thank you to Reshaping Work for putting on today's event and for this timely panel on platforms and regulatory landscape. I've been at Uber for 4 years now. I've spent most of that time in the UK, which I'm sure my accent gives away. And I've recently taken on a new role in Amsterdam, heading up labour relations for Uber in Europe and the Middle East and Africa. Over my time with Uber in London, a lot changed. In 2021, the UK Supreme Court determined that private hire drivers should have protections in a judgment that enabled the provision of benefits for the first time, whilst leaving the door open for flexibility. This provided us with the clarity we needed to pursue a model that provided new benefits such as national minimum wage protections, pensions, and holiday pay, whilst also preserving the freedom of drivers to work when, where, and how suited their lives. We often refer to this as flexibility, as I'm sure you've heard many times. But logging on and off when they want, accepting or not accepting job offers as they choose, and working elsewhere and for competitors as and when they like, all whilst collecting the first pension in the gig economy became possible. We also recognised the GMB union in the UK, the first national union agreement for Uber anywhere in the world. And we've worked with them since to improve Uber's offer to drivers, the union providing them with meaningful representation. I suppose, as we all recognise, and some of the other members on the panel have, the current employment system around the world is outdated and unfair because some workers have access to benefits and protections whilst others don't. And as I start in my new role, I'm very interested to learn more about how we can bring these protections and representation to platform workers elsewhere, whilst maintaining the flexibility that brings them to the platform in the first place. And that's what I want to talk about here today. So this panel comes at a great time as governments across the world, including here in the EU, are working on answering one key question: how to regulate platform work. Platform work is not without its problems, I don't think anyone would say that, but for the greater majority of those who work through the Uber platform, it's an opportunity that offers good and rewarding work. To measure the success of these regulatory efforts at the end of the day, we're going to need to focus on the outcomes for platform workers in their real lives. Do they meaningfully impact on issues like earnings, safety, and freedom? Are the changes they bring what the platform workers in question want or need, or do they change the nature of the opportunity such that it is no longer right for them, or worse, doesn't exist at all? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for these opening statements and reflections. Now we go a bit more specific to the directive, the platform directive proposed by the European Commission. And there is the issue of legal presumption listing 5 criteria, and I invite Hannekke now to go over them and put your reflections on this specific proposal.
Yes.
And then the others can add.
Yes. Well, the legal presumption is phrased as follows. It says that everyone who works through a platform shall be legally presumed to be in an employment relationship if there is control over the work. And then the question is, of course, when is there controlling the performance of work? And then the article says if you fulfill 2 out of 5 criteria, then we assume that there is control over the performance of the work, and thus there is an employment relationship. So that's the system, and this can be rebutted, but I will get back to that later. And the 5 criteria are, first of all, if the platform determines or sets upper limits for the remuneration, it's a criterion, it's the first. The second is sees to the possibility for the platform to require the person performing work to respect certain binding rules on the performance of the work. It's what we know as the right to give instructions on the performance of the work. That's the second one, binding rules on the performance of the work or the service. The third criterion is about the supervision. It's about platforms supervising or verifying the quality of the work of the service. And the fourth one and the fifth one are more about restricting what the platform worker can do. The fourth criterion says if the platform effectively restricts the freedom to organize one's work. So that was what Anja was talking about. If you have no freedom to decline a shift or to perform or organize your work in a certain way, then it's an indication that there might be a employment relationship. And that's about working hours, absence, or accept of refusing tasks, or giving the tasks to subcontractors. And the fifth one is a bit not similar, but also sees to the platform worker. If the worker is effectively restricted, and as a lawyer you always want to know what's the difference between restricted and effectively restricted, but I'll leave that one because Koen asked me not to be too lawyerish, but it's really interesting. If you restrict the possibility to build a client base, or to perform your work for any third party. So, in other words, if you restrict the entrepreneurship of a worker, that's the fifth criterion. So then the question is, what do we feel? How do we feel about this criteria? And is it a good thing to have a rebuttable presumption or these criteria? First of all, I think that the criteria are well known and recognizable for everyone who has been into the classification debate, because you see them quite frequently in national and EU case law or jurisprudence. So it's not new, so to say. Secondly, you can ask whether this rebuttable presumption, regardless of the criteria, is within the competence of the EU, because it kind of takes a very firm standpoint and a decision on who is an employee or not, and that's traditionally something that the member states are allowed to decide upon and not the EU. And then obviously someone could say, but that you can rebut this, right? It's a rebuttable presumption, so that's no problem, because you can always get away from that. So it's not the EU directive that decides it. But if you look at the way the rebuttal is phrased in Article 5, at least phrased before it's maybe or probably rephrased in a second phase, it refers to the national definition of an employee or an employment relationship. So we're okay about that. It's cool. It's regulated. But if you see the comments that have come to this directive, draft directive, you can see that it's kind of swiped out. And then I again have this problem of the competence of the EU to regulate this. And the second issue I have with this proposal is that I think it's also a shift of the debate. Now we have the debate on is there an employment relationship? Is there authority from one party over another party? And the debate will shift to the question whether or not the employing party is a digital labor platform or not, because that's another definition that is in this directive, right? So then the first standpoint I can imagine would be, I'm not a digital labor platform because I don't fill in this definition, and then we get a whole lot of case law on that one. And there is more to say about these 5 criteria, but I think that Anja has also thoughts about that, and Koen is very strict on time, so this is my preliminary remark.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'll ask Anja to reflect further.
Yeah, thanks, Hannekke. I think you said a lot already, and indeed my point would also be that, well, in practice, it will be the national member state, the national courts, who will judge on a case-by-case basis if this labor relation constitutes an employment relationship or not. So I'm not sure what is the additional value of these criteria. And also, for example, if we take the case of Belgium, there we had a Deliveroo case for the court. We also had that in the Netherlands, so it's the same company. And the question was, are these workers working for the Deliveroo platform, are these self-employed workers or are these employees? And in Belgium, you have a kind of what is proposed now, a rebuttable presumption. So there's also a list of categories, and if 3 are fulfilled, then it is assumed or presumed that the labor relation constitutes an employment relationship. But then it is rebuttable, so the other party can also then say that it does not constitute an employment relationship. And what we saw, what we have seen in Belgium, that despite the fact that the three criteria were fulfilled, the court decided, no, this relationship does not constitute an employment relationship, but this worker is self-employed. Whereas in the Netherlands, where we don't have this rebuttable presumption, we see that the Court of Appeal has decided, no, this is an employment relationship, so this worker is an employee. So without having this rebuttable presumption. So this shows that I would say that these criteria, well, you can question what is the additional value of having those criteria.
Yeah, thanks. And Bogdan, you have been very close to the fire last 10 months after this directive has been published. So can you reflect on what happened?
I can tell you a little bit what's going on right now, but I want to just take a little break to extract myself from the discussion on the very concrete criteria, just to explain a wider stance. What's happening now at the level of the political families of Europe is a little bit of change in the conventional interpretation on what constitutes or not the ability of the EU to legislate in social and labor law. And we have a big precedent happening this year with the adoption of the minimum wage directive, which as little as I think 6 months before we got a trilogue deal, people were lining up to say this is outside of the competence, this is outside of the scope, it will never fly. So just to say that if the powers that be, so that means the big political families of a majority of member states want it, it's surprising what they can achieve. And this has nothing to do, or it has a lot to do with data, but it has a lot more to do with narrative of the times where we are now and the stories that go around. Going back to the directive, well, I would like to comment on the criteria, but just to give you a little bit of information, the rapporteur's first draft in the parliament took out the criteria entirely from the active part of the text. That means from the articles, put them in a recital as fully lateral components, de facto writing automatic presumption. And we are now negotiating them back in. It's very hard to say where it's going to end up, but there's basically 2 big political blocks formed. One, and you can guess, I guess, the political families, you know, and the direction from which arguments come. And one block is basically arguing for a more concrete and harsher text with, it's still around the same criteria, you know, tweaking of wordings. A big point is the definitions. So before we get to the criteria, we have to define exactly what we are talking about, and the definitions are even defining things which between member states don't have the exact same legal definition, so that's actually one of the big points. And then of course the rebuttable presumption, how does that work? So this block is a bit more strict there, it's a wider angle, a wider coverage. And there's a whole new dimension on this directive where people who had nothing to do with platform work or felt they had little to do are now realizing they might actually come under the scope of the directive. And that's another challenge that we're facing. And of course, there's another block that wants to see basically more or less a return to the Commission proposal. This is also the block that initially had a majority and pushed, and I recommend you to read the resolution of the Parliament in 2021, which is an own initiative resolution, where we felt we outlined what we'd like to see, also the criteria and so on. And it's a very tight combat, I would say, and combat negotiation. We'll see how it ends up, but after that we'll have to go to the Council. The Council is also changing every few weeks its position. And again, my feeling is that the key spaces is the definition before you go to the criteria. Because afterwards, of course, national parliaments will have to adapt it, and then only it will go to the court. So there's going to be a whole level of a whole process. depending on whoever is in government at that time, when there are the next elections, what's the political will, because of what I said at the beginning, the narrative. The platform worker narrative, the platform companies stories is a strong political case beyond any kind of labor law. And it's yesterday, not yet, 2 days ago, I saw a movie presented in the European Parliament by the rapporteur, Made in Italy, which was basically a whole Black Mirror, but in Italy, movie about the evils of algorithms. And that's basically, you know, it's a big political stance, a big political narrative. So you'd be surprised what could come up. We definitely are really trying to find a harmony between the two sides, but we'll see how it goes.
Okay, but on the principles underlying the proposed directive, you think it's sound and workable?
I think that from the Commission original proposal, we had something to work with. I think the proposal of the rapporteur, where the criteria were completely taken out and basically every self-employed person in Europe would have been classified, and by the way, not just in platform work again, as a worker, was totally something we could not accept, a full red line. Again, I work in the Renew Europe group, but I think on that specific part, the majority of the parliament would have agreed. We'll see, by the way, how that goes at the vote. At this time, a real coordination, if you will, of the activities of member states in this is welcome. So then you give member states some criteria that they have to use, and they give them an end goal. And in a way, that was for us the biggest problem with the whole space, the goal. You want to have the workers, either employees or self-employed, protected and with access to social information, opportunities, so on and so forth. The problem here is that if you even put them all in as employees, so you force them not to be self-employed, that's not going to solve, in our view, the problem of, for example, in-work poverty, which we will be creating by doing that. And also, by the way, we don't think that a one-size-fits-all approach works, because you have, for example, in cities like Cluj, which is a highly developed IT city in Romania, platform gig workers working for a pretty penny, by the way, for companies. We would definitely not want to be classified as employees and start to pay, you know, all the other things. So it's a very complicated issue. Yeah. And again, we're trying to find the balance.
Yeah, thanks. Emma, curious to know your thoughts.
Thank you. I mean, well, the first thing I'd say is we welcome the Commission's initiative. It seeks to provide platform workers with new protections, and bringing greater legal certainty and ensuring a level playing field are all things that are really needed. To go back to what I said at the start, it's kind of long been our view that providing greater benefits and protections for workers without impinging on flexibility is perfectly possible, and it's something that we should all be prioritising. I think our concern would be with the current proposals, where it centres around a rebuttable presumption that may be seen as a solution, given that benefits are traditionally associated with employment status, but there are pitfalls that regulators need to consider. I think the number one amongst these is that what do platform workers want themselves? The flexibility offered by platforms is one of the big reasons why they choose to work with us. And in our own survey in 2021 across the EU, 91% of our couriers and drivers said that number one, the reason they chose Uber was flexibility. Number two, it most likely is going to lead to fewer opportunities, as we saw in Geneva, where courier numbers are down 67%. And according to some sector studies, the proposed rebuttable labour presumption could lead to a loss of about 400,000 jobs. It also negatively impacts their earnings potential, as it removes their ability to switch between platforms and take better paying job offers at a moment's notice. 3, it doesn't offer new benefits or protections to those who are not reclassified, which we think is a big miss. Platform workers that are not reclassified and who remain self-employed will not get greater benefits and protections, and platforms may be hesitant to provide them given the new litigation risk that will come with it. Finally, it's probably going to lead to more and not less litigation, as some other people on the panel have commented on. The version of the presumption proposed by the Commission risks increasing the likelihood of litigation, creating legal uncertainty and unnecessary business model changes potentially. Thankfully, Uber has better experts than me on EU affairs. He's sitting in the front row over there. You can chat to him if you want to talk about the detail of the directive. But I think, moreover, our concerns are that, as drafted, the criteria are vague in some places, and they kind of could create a high risk of unintended consequences. Practically, a platform that ensures that there's no slice missing from your pizza, or that the delivery person gets road safety training to keep themselves safe, are going to be caught by these criteria. And there's some work to be done for this proposal to be workable for any marketplace that needs to have some rules to protect the interests of everyone who uses them, be that the local food market down the road or Amazon. And last but not least, any law is as good as the enforcement that accompanies it. More important than creating law will be making that fair and equitable. In Spain, where we changed our business model to comply with the new law, other platforms did not follow suit and the authorities were unable to enforce. And I can speak from my own experience in the UK, where nearly 2 years on, we're the only people responding to the Supreme Court's judgment. Thanks.
Okay. Any reactions, or shall we move on to alternative solutions? Yeah, go ahead.
Just a small comment. There's a lot of discussion about what happens after this gets adopted, and that's a discussion that was very rational. The member states are all very concerned about how they themselves can enforce it, check it, do all the things, and every time the Parliament or the Commission come up with obligations for the governments, they don't like that very much. At the same time, a positive thing to say is that when we do adopt legislation, even when it's about directives, even sometimes when it's not legislation, when it's just council recommendations, the very fact that there is a guiding document leads to a certain alignment between markets and between companies. The very fact that you do have something to use at the level of the EU gives companies that operate across borders guidelines and helps them actually have predictability when they don't go to those respective courts. So there's also, beyond the very first letter of the law, there's a reaction to this kind of adoption that can lead to a certain, improvement overall of situations.
Okay. Yeah, I also wanted to add that also when this proposal is adopted and it is implemented in a national law, it only means, and also when a worker is classified, when a platform worker is classified as a worker in accordance with the proposal, then this will mean that this worker falls under the scope of workers' protection according to EU law. And that is different from, for example, the employment protection we have in the Netherlands, because the scope of Dutch labor law is broader than the scope of employment protection at the level of the EU. So that is one thing. So there's still a difference. We are creating a different category of workers. In case the Dutch courts will say, will decide, okay, these workers are employees, like other employees. So in that case, the workers will fall under the scope of Dutch labor law. Then probably those workers will be 0-hour workers, because that's how a lot of platform works. And that means that it will be difficult, that it will be difficult for some workers to get access to some social security benefits. Just so this is not only the case in the Netherlands, but I think even more in other EU countries, because they don't fulfill certain criteria to become eligible for social security benefits. And for the Netherlands, if one example, for example, when a 0-hour worker gets sick after having done a job, after having been called upon work, then this person is not entitled to the payment of wages, which a normal worker employee is, because he was not ill during work, but after his or her assignment. And he is also not entitled to sickness insurance, because this situation is accepted, is an exemption from sickness insurance. So here we already see a gap, and this is also what will be happening to platform workers who will be working as employees, but as 0-hour workers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Hannekke, or?
Yes, if we're still good in time, I would like to...
Yeah,
yes?
Go ahead.
I have been thinking about one other effect, possible effect of this directive in whatever form it will eventually or not be, well, if it will eventually be adopted. If you start creating tailor-made legal frameworks for specific groups of workers, it responds to our natural wish to have every situation dealt with as correctly and as justified and as fair as possible, right? So that's a very good feeling. On the other hand, if you keep making tailor-made regimes for certain groups, you create a quite complex system. And complexity has many disadvantages, but there are two that we have seen in the recent past quite clearly. One effect of complexity of rules is that vulnerable people and precarious workers or any other citizen will not find their way through it. And they get kind of squeezed between the complexity of rules. Another effect of complexity of rules or a complex legal framework is that it creates a lot of possibilities for those who can oversee everything to arbitrate, to choose, to find where they can wiggle around, to find where they can choose what is beneficial for them. And that's, I'm trying not to be normative about it, but these are two consequences of a complex regulatory framework, not only in labor law, but everywhere. And I think that's something we have to consider, because platform work, maybe in a conference like this, or for people like us who deal with it on a daily basis, it's not the world, right? I mean, the world is bigger than just platform work. So if we start with this, I see this risk of increased complexity with the two consequences I just mentioned. So I wanted to, it's broader than just the criteria, but I wanted to mention it.
Well, maybe I can stick with you then, Hannekke, because we then are left with the question, what are the alternatives? And you just told me you have a utopian alternative, but let's think big, and that's why I would like to start with you, and the others can follow again.
Yes, that's the risk, right, of having these big thoughts. And it might be a bit, yes, you can never stop dreaming. I think we should get away from using the employment contract and the employment relation as the means of safeguarding the basic principles of labor law, compensating for the inequality of bargaining power and organizing the labor market. I think it's not fitting anymore in the current world. And then the question is indeed, what's the alternative? And I think the alternative would be a single work contract, maybe a single open-ended contract, but just doesn't really matter what your relationship looks like. You have one type of contract if you do it. And most of the social protection and social security should be arranged for in some kind of base layer that's the same for everyone. And it doesn't really matter whether you're an independent worker, whether you're an independent platform worker, whether you work for a company. And it's an ideal that I have, which is very difficult to realize, because we have these systems, we're used to it, and just breaking them down and starting with a new house, I know it's impossible. But I think looking through it through this lens, instead of keep working on the house we have, might open some perspectives. And I think that would help, and I think it would also help. I had a discussion with one of the people in the audience earlier about competition law. It might also be worth looking at other areas of law to redesign what we have. So one single contract for everyone who works, and recreating a new system of social protection with a base layer would be, in my opinion, a great start.
Okay, who wants to follow on? Emma? Yeah? Okay,
yeah.
go ahead.
Well, it sounds like a great idea. Imagine the devil's in the detail, but keep listening.
That's true.
Yeah. But probably, perhaps not too dissimilar to that. I'm kind of going to sound like a broken record now, but we think that better access to benefits and protection should exist irrespective of status, and that the current model is unfair because it only attributes it to those of them who are employees and not to those who aren't at all. But most of our critics argue that forcing drivers and couriers to be employees is the only way to support them. However, a modern approach can reshape the binary model. Several countries have gone for reforms that look at this and from different perspectives. So I mentioned the UK, is where I'm from, but the Supreme Court judgment provided legal certainty for the sector in a way that wasn't there before, and it enabled Uber to offer additional protections. In Greece, the government passed a reform clarifying the conditions of legitimate self-employment, and at the same time allowed companies to offer additional protections and benefits without the risk of reclassification for self-employed people. In Italy, a collective agreement enabled by local laws between a union and delivery association guaranteed per trip earnings, bonuses and safety whilst preserving flexibility. And finally, in France, most recently, a reform led to the first elections of representatives of platform workers who can engage modern and meaningful social dialogue between platforms and workers. So there are new and different ways emerging.
Anja.
Yes. So I was just thinking about your proposal, Hannekke, and I was wondering, indeed, how it would, because how it would relate to competition law. Maybe you could say something about that. That's a question.
Depending on what part of competition law you're talking about, but I assume you were referring to the self-employed not being able to negotiate because they might be a cartel or something. Well, I think in many proposals and some jurisdictions that is already off the table, so it kind of... there is the EU guidance that was published. Yes, exactly. Yes, so it's... but then the question is, and I think that was a point you made yourself before we got here, if the impediment is off the table, and then you realize that they're still not negotiating and they're still not collectively reunioning themselves, then the question is, what next? Then you have to say, well, we offered it, it's possible they don't do it, so probably they don't want it. I mean, that's referring to what you said, we did a query and nobody wants it. Then the subsequent question is, and then what? If they don't want it, it's okay? Or do we feel that we need a different type of society where we kind of offer something else? Or then if no one negotiates for themselves, then we have a different kind of base layer? I don't know. It's a political question. It's not a legal question. And another perspective from competition law could be that but that's very slippery for me because it's not my field of law, but the traditional idea that you have to protect the consumer from market parties that have unfair competition and then have negative effects on the position of the consumer, that's not the field of power that's anymore there when you talk about platforms, because it's not just the consumer, it's the independent worker, it's a platform, it's a restaurant if it's meal delivery. It's a far more complex field of powers where you can't have this one-dimensional thing. You have the producer and the consumer. That's not what's happening anymore. So you have to go back, but that's what I keep saying, you have to go back to the basic principles and see how you can develop an easier legal framework. And I agree, it's an illusion that it will ever happen, but that's why I'm an academic for now. So.
But Anja, you question the effectiveness of collective bargaining because it's not happening?
Yeah, so that was what Hannekke just mentioned. In the Netherlands, it's already possible for a year, I think, that platform workers may, so self-employed platform workers are allowed to engage in collective bargaining, but it's not happening. So, and then you can raise the question, why is that? And maybe it's because we have a group of very different kind of workers. Some work a few hours, some work a lot of hours. They have different backgrounds. They don't see each other, perhaps, although I see a lot of food delivery riders in groups in Amsterdam, so I'm not sure how about that. But anyway, there is a reason why they are not engaging in collective bargaining. So, and about this regulation, no, it's not a guideline. About this guideline on collective bargaining, not all self-employed workers are included in this. So then we still have, of course, this question, this contradiction between competition law and labor law.
It's also because we're old and conservative and we think that the solution for inequality of bargaining powers is collective bargaining, but it isn't apparently for a lot of people. And it's very difficult for me to imagine, because I grew up in this way of thinking, to imagine what you can put in place that does fulfill the needs of people if it's not working. So it's,
If I may.
And then we go to Bogdan, okay.
Sure. In my experience in the UK, we've had this union deal now for a year and a half. It takes time. right? And because people are not used to engaging with unions, they've not been members ever before in their lives, the union has a job to explain what they're doing and why it's helpful and good. And that some of that takes a little bit of time to work its way through. That would be my reflection.
No.
So you're more hopeful than I am.
Potentially, yeah.
I'll go back to your original question real quick, but first just to address this issue about unionizing and creating unions and the culture of collective bargaining. I have to just say, first of all, Europe is very divided here because you have member states where this is a decades-old practice, where it's actually as common as everything else. And then you have member states where technically you have very big, powerful trade unions that actually are acting de facto as mafia organizations. I know one such member state, I'm from there. And there's no one-size-fits-all solutions, and there's no one solution that will solve everything everywhere. And also, creating something takes time. It took us, how many years ago was Uber a ride-sharing application, and we were having Uber Pop, and now we are having this discussion, and then by the time, hopefully in a few years, we have the next meeting, the Uber drivers will have unionized. This takes time. It's very slow, and it's not a faultless process, and it has never been a faultless process. 50 years ago, when factory workers in Germany were unionizing, and they were abusing the ones who didn't want to be in the union, and there were a lot of issues always with unions everywhere. It's just, I admire very much the countries like, I know, Sweden, where there's a fantastic richness of dialogue and a culture of dialogue that, for example, doesn't exist in my culture, where whatever dialogue happens is only between actor A, who has a vested direct interest, from actor B, and that's the only one reason they would listen. And for us coming and trying to unionize the workers is when even for some of them, trade unions mean something completely different than what they mean here. Is going to be a challenge, and I can give you, just to finish this example, in textile industry we have a lot of factories where workers work for foreign companies, and they're basically in work poverty and exploited and so on, and they were offered to unionize, and they refused because from them the idea of a union was a bad thing. So then they created like a workers representative NGO, which was de facto the same thing, just because they didn't want to have a union. No. Anyway, so coming back to how to solve this beyond legislation, one issue would be to better apply existing legislation wherever that exists. It's not everywhere in the member state that we have adequate legislation. Somewhere we are on a faster speed, but the first step would be to do the checks, apply it, see where you have bogus self-employment. By the way, because all member states have legislation in base defining what is a self-employed person. And if in Austria we have 100,000 care workers being bogus self-employed, and a lot of them being managed by apps, by the way, you should already have the checks before you start legislation again. That would be one thing to do. A second thing I was going to say, collective bargaining and dialogue, but that's already been addressed. And a third thing to do beyond, in parallel with legislation, is also push companies to have a social responsibility towards their workers and actually their communities. Because to give you a clear example, the vast majority of couriers are young people. And they are people who don't probably dream of doing this for the rest of their lives. A lot of them are students, that's hence why they like the flexibility. But it would be good if the platform thinks about these people to give them something after they are done working them, besides the very basic salary. For example, give them skilling opportunities, upskilling opportunities. The drivers, for example, in Romania, to become a driver for a platform, you have to get a permit, and not all platforms help drivers get that permit, which, by the way, the person is left with that permit after he or she stops cooperating with the platform. So there's a dimension beyond direct legislation where companies, if they take the time, can make their people happier, their collaborators, drivers, whatever they are. And I think that can also have a better impact for the companies themselves, both reputational, because again, I was talking about the narrative, and that's a big issue here, but also, giving them a more stable, skilled workforce from whence they can pull flexible workers need. Because, by the way, also platforms, sometimes there's this idea that there's always disposable workers, and in some countries, in some places, that has been sometimes a practice, and in other countries, in other places, the very same platform companies have a trouble finding and recruiting workers for their needs. So also that's a responsibility that somebody who wants to make a profit today, but also in 5 years from now should be aware of and be responsible about it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think we can move to the audience, and there are people with microphones. There's a first hand just over there.
Hi.
You were raising your hand. No, yeah. Okay. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Hi.
Maybe you can introduce yourself.
I'm Martijn. I'm the founder of Bestellerbij.nl. We're a cooperative worker-owned food delivery platform that just started here in the Netherlands. Yeah. Just a quick thought on the last
just please
discussion.
Ask your question to the panel. Is that
okay.
Yeah, okay.
Do you... What I feel sometimes is the solution from a governmental level is always seems to be just add more money. But do you feel are you not afraid that if you make it too strict, and I'm actually happy to hear your fears that you shouldn't make it too strict, but that at some point we're just left with the big companies that can afford all this, and whether or not the rest of the local economies can afford it is kind of lost. How do you think about that?
Regulation comes at a cost.
Actually, that's why, and I'm going to be very honest here, that's why my political family really did not like the proposal of the rapporteur on this file, because there's a lot of little platforms out there. Everybody's talking about Uber, but I'm going to be honest, if probably tomorrow Uber is forced to hire all its drivers, it might be one of the few companies which can survive that economic shock, and there's a lot of little companies who will not. And that's why we're trying to have a real rebuttable presumption. That's why we're fighting not to put those criteria in the recitals, and that's why we're trying to have a definition that allows member states to allow businesses to also flourish. We think, by the way, the directive is good for companies as well, because it's going to create predictability, and knowing that tomorrow a court case in Milan or a court case in Madrid is not going to mess up their whole business model. But going back, and I think I'm going to say it many times about the narrative is Uber. It's even like you forget there's other companies than Uber. I guess it has to be frustrating to be Wolt or Bolt or from sometimes when it comes to this, and people forget, and we're trying. It's good that you exist, and you should make everybody aware that you exist.
I think in your previous contribution, you also said something that is very, very true. Because what you are pointing out is that the world is full of natural enemies, right? In Amsterdam, it's cyclists and taxis. And entrepreneurs and rules is kind of the same thing. The more rules, the more difficult it is to be an entrepreneur and to start a business. But rules are there, and they are implemented and created, and they grow because people don't act, or companies or whatever don't act in a way we feel is fair and equal. And what you said about taking your social responsibility would take away a lot of the issues, because if you don't have to point out everything in rules and have to enforce them and then complain that they're not enforced and then to circumvent them and then to proceed about it, but just do the right thing. And I know it sounds idealistic, but it would take away a lot of the need to have so many detailed rules that you rightfully point out damage the smaller entrepreneurs. And that's, I think, your call to take more responsibility, social responsibility is a very good one.
Okay, I think we can move to another question. There's one over here. Please state your name and...
Thank you very much. Thanos Moisiadis with Uber. The question actually is going to the academics. So you hinted at this. The proposal as it's currently drafted on the directive is practically creating a specific subset of rights for a specific subcategory of self-employed people. how this will practically evolve, because generally speaking, the narrative was, to Bogdan's point, that a third status, and rightfully so, is not the solution, because actually you just double the cases of reclassification. You don't create legal certainty. But in reality, now you will have a specific category of self-employed with very specific criteria that will apply, in theory, only to them, creating de facto a third status. So how legally this is viewed currently?
Yeah, maybe can you repeat your last sentence?
Yes. So the fact that we will have a third status,
Yes.
practically speaking,
Yeah, okay.
how this will impact these type of cases. Like, it's not going to be a worker status as in the UK where you know what you're having, but will a court end up saying you are not a self-employed, you are not an employee, you are in that weird thing in between that doesn't have a name but does have specific control criteria that apply only to them, or specific benefits that apply only to them and no one else?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think it will have an impact on how the law is, because it will in the Netherlands we will then have 3 categories of workers. So now we have 2, and then we have more than 2, but those the third or the fourth are really residual categories. So then we will have a third big category. And I think what can happen is, when we create this third category, that also workers who are now categorized as an employee will also move to this intermediate category. Or what is also possible is that more self-employed people will move to this intermediate category. So from the perspective of social protection, as a social lawyer, I would have this perspective. You can have 2 directions. On one hand, people may get less protection, because employees will be reclassified as workers. And on the other hand, you may have more protection, because self-employed will be reclassified as this intermediate category. And how this, what direction will be taken, I can't predict this, because you see also in different countries where you've seen the establishment of this intermediate category, you've seen different directions have been taken. So, yeah.
Well, and the lawyer's paradise will be there forever, right?
That's also
Will keep us
a lot of
busy.
work for labor lawyers. So we earn a lot. You will earn a lot of money.
So I think there's room for a final question, if any. And yeah, please state your name and affiliation.
Hi, my name is Maudi Derks, and I'm a founder of Actio, and Actio is the private social security executor in the Netherlands. And I'm referring directly to you. I was quite energized by your vision, your dream, and I think it's actually manageable if you actually look at how you can organize this. So I would like to invite myself to discuss this with you.
You're most welcome. It's an energetic dream, but I never get any further, so please do.
Well, I think this sums up the aim of the conference, to make new connections between new type of actors, and I thank all the members very much for their participation. Give them a big hand.